Hello. Today I'm fortunate as I'm recording to have lots of nice sunshine coming through the window. But since Easter, our weather's been really very unpredictable. We've had snow, we've had lots of heavy frosts. In fact, I've been fortunate that with the stay at home and of Chris not at work, I haven't had to go out and scrape the car windows. But in some places, it's more than just an inconvenience. I looked at the news this week and they explained that last week in France, a heavy frost devastated some vineyards. They think that maybe 50 to 80% of the vines were lost because the frost just damages this young growth. Almost before the season starts, they're in trouble. Now I don't know, even with all this sunshine and even with climate change, I don't think we'll ever properly grow grapes here in Northern Ireland. I'm sure someone in the comments will tell me I'm wrong, but that's just me, but what do I know? But reading and hearing about vines and vineyards reminded me of a well-known passage in the Bible. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes it to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me, and I in them, bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. And such branches are gathered and thrown into the fire and burned. After the Last Supper, the Passover meal that Jesus shared with his disciples, Jesus says to them, "Let us go from here." And so we know that it's a changed location. And so they probably left the upper room, made their way out of the city, past the gate, towards the Mount of Olives. And as they went, Jesus shares his teaching about a vine or a vineyard with them. I don't know, maybe you'd like to think of Jesus and his disciples walking. Maybe they passed a vineyard, or perhaps a vine growing over the side of a building. But it doesn't really matter. You see, this idea of a vine or a vineyard would have already been very familiar to the disciples, or indeed any well-read Jew. You see, the vine metaphor has deep significance in the Old Testament. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, Israel is frequently identified as a vine. The Lord will speak of himself as the vineyard owner or a vine dresser. And in these passages, he plants, he prunes, and he cares for the vine. The vine is his people. However, most of the time, these metaphors speak about God's disappointment and the judgment that he's going to bring upon his vine because they produced bad fruit. For example, in Jeremiah we read this: "I planted you as a choice vine, from the purest stock. How then did you turn degenerate and become a wild vine?" Or as one modern translation puts it, "You were a choice grapevine, but now you produce nothing but small, rotten fruit." And in Isaiah, the Lord speaks through the prophet. He speaks to his people and he says, "What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold, an outcry." So, not only would this Old Testament theme of Israel and God's vines being well known to Jesus' followers, But they would also know that Israel had failed to produce good fruit, the very fruit that the Lord had desired. Rather than establishing justice and righteousness, God's people had become corrupt. They mistreated the poor and the immigrants among them. They strayed away from God's law. They become prideful in their worship. And it's not just Jesus that said this. At the time, there were numerous revival movements amongst the Jews. And they believed and they argued that it was possible to bear good fruit. They believed that when they grew this perfectly good fruit, when they could re-establish their vocation as God's vine. And how did they believe this was going to be possible? How would it happen? Well, they believed it would happen through strict adherence to the Torah, to the law. They put their faith in the keeping of the law. And so now Jesus picks up this metaphor, this symbol, this idea that had been so well known to his disciples, and he says, I am the true vine. Well, now you know the context and the background of this metaphor. You can just imagine the disciples' amazement when Jesus declared himself, rather than the whole nation, to be God's vine. I am the true vine, and my Father the vine dresser. Now please, don't miss what's going on here. Jesus was identifying himself as the fulfillment of Israel's purpose. And unlike the other rabbis who taught that good fruit came from observance of the Torah, keeping the law, Jesus said that good fruit was only possible by abiding in him. Jesus is doing something here, and not for the first time. Jesus is putting himself in the place of both God's people and God's law. Jesus puts himself in the place of both God's people and God's law. Earlier in John's Gospel, Jesus identified himself as the true temple. He also described himself as the true bread from heaven. And it's precisely this kind of talk, this kind of stuff, that made the religious authorities want to kill him. And now, on the night of his death, he declares himself to be the true vine. Jesus, by now, he'd already declared himself to be the fulfillment of everything sacred to the Jewish people. The temple, the scriptures, the sacrifices, the festivals. And now, by saying, I am the true vine, he was also declaring himself to be the fulfillment of Israel's very purpose for existing. But what does this really mean? Well, his statement carries at least two important implications that are then explained and unpacked throughout the rest of the New Testament. So let's have a look at them. Firstly, Jesus is changing what it meant to belong to God's chosen people. Accident of birth would no longer define your membership of God's chosen people. Rather than a status inherited through one's parents or dependent on your ethnicity, your nationalism, your tribalism, God's family was now defined by those who belong to Jesus, regardless of their origin. Paul makes the very same point in Romans. In chapter 11, he also uses the same metaphor of vine and branch. He says that being ethnically or culturally Jewish is no longer the gateway into God's family, but rather it's belonging to Jesus. This is why, within one generation, the Christian community was entirely different from the Jewish sect it began, and it was a multi-ethnic, multi-generational, it was a movement unlike any other the world had ever seen. It's why today we're Christians, not Jews. It's not our identity that defines us as part of God's chosen people. It's Jesus' identity that defines it. Sadly, there are still some today who assume that a right standing with God is a matter of tribal identity and external markers. Do you belong to the right church? Do you vote for the right kind of party? Do you follow the right traditions? Do you conform to the right cultural views? If so, their argument goes, then you must belong to God. No, no, no. The chosen people are defined by Jesus. We are part of that group only if we are connected to Jesus and find our identity in him. Jesus is the true vine. Secondly, by calling his disciples to bear good fruit through him, Jesus was declaring the insufficiency of the law alone. Despite what the other religious teachers taught, despite what all the other revival movements said, keeping the law would not bring renewal to God's people. Despite what other religious leaders taught, strict adherence to the symbols, the rituals, all those customs that are outlined in the Old Testament would not bring renewal to God's people. Now, if we're honest, this is the teaching we struggle with. I mean, we don't really get caught up too much of worrying about Jesus as the way he defines God's family. I mean, after all, most of us aren't ethnically Jewish, so the only way we're ever going to be part of God's chosen people is through Jesus. So we don't worry about that. But like the other teachers in Jesus' time, we seem to think that we can revive or reform God's people by keeping the law. We think that we can be his perfect people by perfectly keeping his law. But on the night of his death, Jesus says no. Jesus, on the way to his arrest, tells his disciples that the only way to be a fruitful branch of the vine, to be a member of God's chosen community, is to be connected to Jesus. Fruit comes, he says, not by keeping the law, but by abiding in Christ and letting God's good works blossom in you. To bear good fruit for God's kingdom requires living in perpetual communion with Jesus Christ himself. For thousands of years, God's people discovered they could never try hard enough. The law is insufficient. The law cannot make you a member of the chosen people. The law cannot bring good fruit. The law cannot save. Only Jesus can. Thank God, Jesus can. Because Jesus is the true vine. I'm not very good with houseplants. They normally die and turn into dried plants. The only houseplant I wouldn't mind is a little bonsai tree, but they're a bit too expensive and I'm worried they'll die. These are little trees, they're pruned and wired into shape. They look small but they're old. They're mini trees. And they're supposed to be little small models of real trees, but you look at the shape of these bonsai trees and you think, what real tree looks like that? But when I visited Japan, and I believe it's also true in China, I saw that there were lots of trees that were shaped like the small ones were, but just full size. The gardeners used wire and wood and pruning shears, and they trained and guided the tree. They wouldn't look like that naturally. They look like that because the gardener wants them to. We find our identity in the true vine, in Jesus. And as we are connected to him, he brings about change in our lives. He brings about good fruit. How? Well, there's a gardener, a vine dresser. Referring to himself as the vine, his disciples as the branches, and his Father as the vine dresser, Jesus said, Every branch that bears fruit, my Father prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Now, pruning might look violent or painful, but just like the wire, the wood, and those pruning shears that transform a Japanese tree, the pruning is done on the branch so that it flourishes. God forms us into a plant through which He will grow a bountiful harvest later. Now, before we move on, there's something here that you might miss if your New Testament Greek is a little bit rusty. Jesus says, every branch in me that does not bear fruit, He takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, He prunes, that it may bear more fruit. And the word take away and prune are related. That's why they're tied together there. But also the word translated prune, the root of it also means cleanse. That's why the next verse talks about being cleansed. In other words, in order to bear good fruit, two things must happen. You must be pruned or trained, you must be disciplined or formed by God, and you must be cleansed. The problem of sin needs to be attended to. Now, very often we try to do these two things to ourselves. We try to bring out discipline for ourselves. We try to work harder. We try not to sin. We try to be perfect. We try to clean ourselves. But according to Jesus, whose job is this? Is it ours? No. According to Jesus, whose job is this? God's. How does it happen? By abiding in the true vine. Jesus repeatedly calls upon His disciples to abide in me. Drawing on the metaphor, He said, as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. And He goes on to use the word abide, or in some translations the word is remain, at least 10 times in these few verses. So obviously Jesus is emphasizing a very important point that hinges entirely on how we understand that command to abide in Him. Often we think of it as some kind of emotional or connection or something to do with feelings, but it's not a feeling, it's an action. Jesus explains it by describing how He is connected to the Father. Jesus defines what abiding in Him means by comparing it to the way He abides in the Father. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in His love. In other words, if we are connected to Him, we will find our identity in Him. So we will choose to reflect His character, be more like Him, by allowing Him to shape us, to prune us, so that we bear His good fruit and follow His commands. So simply put, abiding is an action, not an emotion. So why is all this important? Jesus says, by this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples. Jesus is saying that it's not enough to simply be a branch that's connected to the vine. We need to be a branch that's bearing fruit because we're connected to the vine. Not just any branch, but a branch bearing fruit because of that connection. And that's what makes a true disciple. So what happens to the branches that don't bear fruit? Well, they're either so weak that they die and fall off, or they're pruned by the gardener, and then they're all swept up and burnt on the bonfire. Judgment is not a popular topic. But Jesus warns that if you're not connected to God, If you don't abide in him, if you don't let him prune you and cleanse you, if you don't let him discipline you, if you don't let him forgive you, if you don't let him grow fruit in you, if you don't let his good works show in your life, then your identity is not in the true vine. Your identity is in dried up branches. Your identity is kindling. Your identity is not in the vine. It's in the bonfire. This is why it matters. This is why Jesus says this on the most important night of his life. As he goes to the cross, he wants his disciples to know how to escape the fate and find their identity in him. He wants them to know that they can be part of the chosen people. He wants them to know how to abide in the true vine, how to bear good fruit by being connected to him. Jesus is the true vine. And he tells us that we can share in that identity by abiding in him. He is offering us membership in the chosen people. And that membership, that identity is not based on nationality, ethnicity, exclusivity, class, money, or any other defining characteristic. It's found in accepting Jesus and his identity. He's also telling us that the law can't save. And in case you missed it, Paul will bang on about it. And so will I. Because I've seen lives destroyed for an attempt to earn their own salvation. Jesus is the true vine, and he invites us to find our identity, our purpose, our meaning, our fulfillment, our future, our everything in him. Abide in the true vine. Allow the gardener to prune you and cleanse you. Allow God to change your life. Allow God to deal with the problems of sin and ill discipline. Allow God to work in you. Let God's good works bring his fruit to your life. Become a disciple through whom the power of God's Spirit flows, and through whom God's Spirit moves, and through whom God's Spirit acts. Become a branch, but not any branch. Become a living branch. Become a fruit-bearing branch. Become a branch of the true vine. May you become a branch of the true vine, Jesus Christ. May the Holy Spirit keep you connected to the vine. May you be cleansed and pruned, and may you produce fruit that glorifies the Father. Amen.